All right. See if we got some people streaming in. Hello. Thanks for coming. We'll get things started in a minute here once we make sure everyone's locked and loaded. But my name is Matt Bose, and I'm the general manager here at New West Press. And thanks for coming out tonight. I don't know where you guys are, but it's raining here right now. And it's a great night to stay indoors and listen to some readings. Just give it another couple seconds here as people connect to audio and can hear our wonderful speakers. Perfect. All right. What do you say, Carolina? Should we go for it? Okay. So, like I said, my name is Matt Bose. I'm the general manager here at New West Press, and thank you for coming out to our launch tonight. We have three great New West authors for you. We got CJ Lavigne, Randy Nikkel Schroeder, and Darcy Tamayose. I would say that their books are connected by being kind of weird, a little bit fantastical, in addition to being literary. So that's kind of my way I'm connecting them tonight. But before we get to them, we have Magda Mulatu from Glass Bookshop, and she's going to talk a little bit about the store and where you can buy these books if you so choose.
Hello, everyone. So fortunate to be in this virtual space with you all tonight, and so thrilled to celebrate our three special guests this evening. My name is Magda Mulatu. Like Matt said, I'm the media and events manager at Glass Bookshop, which happens to be the official bookseller for tonight's program. Both New West Press and Glass Bookshop are based in Amiskwaci, Waskaikan, or what is colonially known as Edmonton, Alberta, here on Treaty 6 territory. Treaty 6 stretches from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to the western borders of Manitoba. Over 70 First Nations reside within this territory, from the Nehiyawak, Tsuut'ina, Anishinaabe, Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Dene, and Inuit, and it is also the homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 4. One way that we like to honor our treaty obligations and support the Indigenous folks that we exist in community with is to spotlight the critical work that's being done by organizations like the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. So the IRSSS is dedicated to providing services to residential school survivors and their families with the goal of maximizing access to culturally sensitive, emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual care. We encourage you all, if you're able, to make a donation by visiting www.irSSS.ca/donate. And I will be sure to pop that link in the chat for those interested. So yeah, like I said, I'm here with Glass Bookshop. And of course, being a bookshop, we have copies of all three of these incredible titles by these incredible authors on hand. We're located on 102nd Avenue and 106th Street here in Edmonton, inside the garage space of Latitude 53. We're open Wednesday through Sunday from 12 to 5 p.m. But if you don't happen to live in YG, or you just can't make it into the shop for whatever reason, maybe the rain deterred you this week, you can also order online at glassbookshop.com. We deliver for free for folks living in Edmonton, St. Albert, and Sherwood Park, and we do that on Wednesdays and Fridays. And we also ship internationally. I'll pop back in towards the end to remind you of all of that good stuff. But for the time being, I'm going to pass things off to Matt, who will introduce our first reader of the evening.
Great, thanks so much, Magda. Glass Bookshop very quickly became one of the best bookstores in Edmonton, and if not all of Western Canada, I would say. They have a great selection, and they feature our books quite heavily as well, so I'm very fond of them. So first up tonight, we have CJ Lavigne, author of In Veritas. So CJ was born in Kingston, Ontario, but grew up all over Canada, Comox, BC to Barrington Passage, Nova Scotia. Since 2007, she's divided her time between Ottawa and Red Deer, where she currently resides and works as a professional communication scholar who writes on television, gaming, and pop culture. At other points in her life, she's been a barista, tech support supervisor, marketing manager, freelance editor, and briefly a radio DJ. In Veritas is her first novel and is part of a New West Unitech First Fiction series, which is our, it's the longest first fiction series in Canada. It's been going since the 90s, and there's been some excellent authors come out of it, and here's one of them right now. So put your hands together for CJ Lavigne.
Great, thanks, Matt. I accept the judgment of this book being weird. Okay, here's a quick reading. The two things you have to know going in, I guess, first of all, the protagonist is synesthetic. So we have Verity and her senses all kind of get mashed together in the descriptions. She sees sound, she tastes words, that kind of thing. She is currently entering an interdimensional space inside the walls of an old theater. She is accompanied by the magician Santiago and his black dog Ouroboros. The bright glow is just ahead, and Verity looks there last, because she suspects the brilliance may blind her. The whiteness is not as sharp as she had thought, however. It resolves into a pale boy sprawled across a short, broken down couch in an unfortunate shade of orange and brown plaid. Its cushions are worn and misshapen. Verity thinks the boy is dying. He's young, but not a child. He has the gangliness of adolescence and a frame like paper stretched over wire. He wears a white shirt and blue jeans. There is light under his skin. It spills from him in a soft, steady glow that illuminates his face and hands. His eyes glitter blue, lit from within by hidden constellations that shine through the thinness of his half-lowered lids. He's looking at nothing in particular. His hands are long-fingered and loose. Behind him, dark wings spread from his shoulders, pressed awkwardly into the couch and splayed raggedly across faded cushions. Oro leaves Verity's side and leaps gracefully up onto the couch, nosing at the boy. The boy's holding a beer bottle in his right hand. He lifts it out of the way without protest, then sips at it and says, "You're back." A sleepy tenor, stretched thin. So she's the one. Hi there. Verity feels tears, shocking and unbidden, welling in the corners of her eyes. She wants to throw herself down in front of the boy. She wants to take his hand and run her fingers through his hair. She does neither of these things. She would never. She only blinks the moisture from her lashes, but the effort trembles from her spine to the tip of her fingers. There's a pause, during which Verity realizes that a small group of the people they've passed has assembled behind her and Santiago and the dog. Their presence is a static tingle between her shoulder blades. Their silence is reverent. She drops her gaze to the floor and the last drift of the boy's words. "Hi," she says uncertainly. "Hi," repeats the boy unnecessarily. "Thanks for coming. This is all pretty weird. I didn't even know she could write." Verity must look blank because the boy adds to Santiago, "You didn't tell her." It's not a question, though concern brushes the edges of his tone. His white lashes lower over the glitter of his gaze, a slow blink, then lift again. The light he casts illuminates the couch cushions, lining his skeletal fingers in an even paler white. The edges of his feathers gleam a little. Nothing of his halo touches Ouroboros, who remains an enigma of solid black. The dog lowers an ear, and Santiago shrugs one shoulder. "She came with Oro, but no, it wasn't my most convincing argument." Even the magician speaks more gently to the boy. There's deference in the set of his jaw. Verity turns her head, casting a quick look toward his face, and he quirks the corner of his lips in what might be apology. It tastes like rosemary and the warm embers of a fire. He picks up a lantern stand, holding it like a staff, and swings it to the side. The lantern sways, casting its dim glow across the block letters that have been crudely smeared across the wall. Verity, they spell, where they haven't begun to drip down in clotting rivulets. Verity had thought the smell of blood was the boy and the boy's incandescent decay. She realizes she was wrong. "Like I said," notes the boy, not unkindly, "it's a new one on me." He takes a pull of his beer and tilts his head, studying Verity with dazed, amiable curiosity. He sits slumped. His pale hair falls tangled in his eyes. She wants again to brush it aside and doesn't. When he shifts on the couch, the lines of his wings pull behind him, long shapes with strange bones beneath. What are we doing with you then? Santiago continues to stand, holding the lantern stand quite still so that the light can fall against the smeared wall. Verity only knows he's looking at her because the dog turns its head to do the same, golden eyes impassive. Behind her, the small group whispers. She divides her attention between the boy's blue eyes and the sea glass glimmer of his words sliding along the worn floorboards. I don't know, she says, honestly, and hears her own voice waver. I want to ask you about this, about spaces between walls, about your wings, about a dog being a snake, but also, whose blood is that? The boy's smile is bright but sad. The last flutter of a butterfly in winter. Jihan's. So we guessed maybe she meant it. He turns his head then and calls to the blackness behind him, where the hall extends well past the fall of any tiny flame. Hey, your friend's here. There are no footsteps. The lamplight glimmers first on a long, thin kitchen knife, and then on the tall figure of the woman who emerges from the shadows. At first, Verity can't tell the difference between the woman and the knife she holds. Both are cold, spare, precisely honed. The woman's eyes are a purer steel, lacking the old blade's spots of rust. Her hair falls in a single gray braid down her right shoulder, but her face is unlined. Her skin is dusky, her nose aquiline and sharp, though not quite straight. It might have been broken once. She wears a pale lavender cardigan, half buttoned and too large, a gray shirt, a pair of torn jeans. One of her sneakers is untied. She doesn't appear to care. The boy's fingers are tight around his bottle. Verity registers the sudden silence behind her and the way the dog has gone stiff. She stands quite motionless, and she tries her best to look at the woman who walks like a sword, but she cannot focus past the sense of burning coals scorching her spine, or the sweep of Ouroboros as it slides down off the couch cushions and crosses the floor to return to her side. She touches the dog's head and it ignores her, crouching slightly on its front paws as it stares up at the approaching woman. Santiago sets the lantern stand down on the floor. It makes a small scraping sound, startling in the stillness. The glowing boy drinks his beer, slouching deeper into the couch as his wings stretch and fold awkwardly across furniture that wasn't meant to fit them. He's the only one not watching the woman as she passes. He is studying Verity, and stars glitter in his eyes. Verity says hi again, because that seems appropriate. She adds helpfully, I'm Verity, and she gestures toward the smears on the wall with one uncertain hand. She hears her own tone turn up a little at the end like a question and thinks Jacob would poke fun, can hear him ask, are you? It occurs to her that the strange woman is very close. The boy's wings rustle as he leans forward to set the bottle down, struggling to rise. Hey, now, what are you doing with, he cuts off with a gasp. And Verity would look to see why, but there's a stinging pressure above her hip, and she's staring straight into a pair of blank steel eyes. The woman's irises are reflective as a cracked mirror. Verity sees her own face, pale and shocked, 1,000 times repeated. In the broken gaps, she sees something more, something cavernous and desperate, and for that yawning chasm, she has no words. Jihan, she thinks, and she's afraid most of all. Fire twists in her gut. Her hands close reflexively around the woman's, just where Jihan still grips the hilt of the knife that has slid seamlessly into the flesh between Verity's lowest ribs. She feels smooth skin, iron fingers, and the sticky heat of her own blood. She's frozen. Jihan's expression is stone. They do not breathe. Time resumes. Someone's yelling. It's okay, says Verity softly. She doesn't know why, but it doesn't feel like a lie. It's just a knife. She doesn't know why she says that either. Jihan's gray brows twitch together in the moment before she steps back. Verity's hands clench around the knife's wooden hilt, and Jihan turns away, her smooth braid draping down like a whip as she walks soundlessly back into the dark. Verity wonders if this blade in her organs should hurt more, but abruptly it does. She tries to gulp a breath and chokes on blood. The blood tastes of copper and salt, but rings in her ears like a gong, and she cannot see it all because her late flowering fear is blooming like poppies, red petals around the lantern lights. She would fall, but there are arms around her, the scent of coal and lilac. It's a garden in a mine shaft. She thinks Santiago is swearing. The boy is there then, mouthing something she can't hear. His eyes are a furious sapphire. The light that shines from within him turns his flesh to something alien and glows incandescent through the thin white fabric of his shirt. At his shoulders, the black wings spread slow and broad to block the light. He is perfect. Verity would be stunned if she were not trying very hard to live. The angel touches her, and the world goes white. In Veritas. Thank you.
All right, it's quite the cliffhanger. So I suggest you go over to the last bookshop and pick up a copy of C.J. Lavigne's In Veritas so you can see what happens. But next up, we have Randy Nikkel Schroeder, whose book Arctic Smoke, I think it's pretty weird. We'll talk about this a little later. I think they've got their strange aspects to them. But Randy grew up Mennonite in Alberta's deep south. As a young man, he fled for the high Arctic and psychologically never came back. He currently lives with his family in Calgary, where he snowshoes in the woods, watches birds, plays guitar and mandolin for his band Uncle Zug. In his spare time, he's professor of English, cultures, and languages at Mount Royal University. To learn more about his work, check out randynickelschroeder.com. So welcome to the stage, Randy.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you, everybody out there in Zoom land. I'm just happy to be part of a panel where all the writers are weird. So that's new for me. Some of you might know that the Ezra of EZRA'S Ghosts is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Darcy, but it's a better looking code for Lethbridge. And since Lethbridge is not, other than I think Timothy Findley's The Wars, it's not a town that pops up a lot in literature. So I thought I'd read a little section that takes place in Lethbridge. And I actually, if I may just tell a quick anecdote. When I was a teenager in North Lethbridge, we had a bunch of people come up and visit us from the States, from Minnesota. And at the end of it, I think my parents asked them, so what do you think of Lethbridge? And they said, well, we find this place to be Twin Peaks North. No, I couldn't have been a teenager because Twin Peaks was after I was. Anyway, if you recognize the 90s reference there, Twin Peaks North means it's pretty weird. So this is from the prologue, and yeah, it's I guess the Lethbridge of my memory and my imagination. Oh, and by the way, I think for the first time ever, I'm going to read from one of my actual books rather than a print off. But, New West is known for beautiful covers. So I thought, you know what, today I'm going to actually read from the book. The Marquis Hotel has a century of murmur in its bones. Tales, too. Inhaled at twilight by hissing vents, circled through hallways and hidden rooms, exhaled at daybreak. Downtown Lethbridge crouches under the edifice, toking its secret histories. The coal baron and his paramour, the runaway pastor's daughter, the felon on the lam, clandestine meetings, illicit love, voyeurs known and unknown, Mormon bishops, gamblers, whores. Townfolk say an entire floor has been closed long as anyone remembers. Ghosts, demons, murder, depends who tells the story. Some say two brothers came down from the high Arctic in the roaring 20s, stayed in the Marquis a whole year. Harut and Marut Darker, both eccentric, both in love with some Japanese women, inexplicably named Zura. When she fled northward with a new lover, a white knife thrower from the local carnival, the brothers' eccentricity turned to madness. Room 113, people say, demolished, sprayed with blood. But who killed whom? Some old Lethbridge folk tell the story differently. Cackle over dark rum cokes or burnt black coffee in taverns grimed with failing light. Insist the brothers did not die, could not die, for they were angels cast from heaven to wander earth, to feed on malice, to tear apart the bonds of love. But the story can never really be told because no thread is ever lost. Every hard choice and chance encounter weaves the tale out of itself, stitching, whirling, snaring, forever knotting and unspooling at the same time. So the angels may still haunt the hallways, but who would know? For the Marquis has lost its voice to carpets, drapes, and pictures, to thick coverlets and layered dust. The century is about to turn. Thank you. That's the book. As I say, beautiful cover. Thank you, Matt and gang.
Thanks, Randy. I believe that cover was by Michelle Verana. And we have 3 different cover designers for these 3 books. I believe Kate Hargreaves did In Veritas, doing the dog snake thing, which CJ was alluding to. And Darcy's book, we had Natalie Olson work on. So we are well known for our designs. It's kind of like a thing that we use as our kind of stamp, something we can try and do and try and make our books stand out a little bit. But last up tonight, we've got Darcy Tamayose, author of the new novel in words story collection. It's kind of got a unique structure to it, and she might tell us a little bit about that one. But Darcy is a writer, graphic designer, and PhD student. Her work, which includes the novel Adori and youth fiction book Katie Be Quiet, received the Canada-Japan Literary Award. And she's also been shortlisted for both the Alberta Writers Guild George Bunier Award and the Forward Indie Juvenile Award. She's worked over a decade as communication officer for the Faculty of Education at the University of Lethbridge. Born and raised in the prairie landscape of Southern Alberta, Tamayose lives there surrounded by daughter, family, and friends. So welcome, Darcy.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to first say, Matt, I agree with CJ and Randy in you saying that, you know, the judgment of this book being weird. Mine's weird too, but I didn't know if you meant just the book or the authors themselves. Anyways, I just want to say thank you, New West Press, for so much, all the pre-production work that led to the publication of EZRA'S Ghosts. It's kind of amazing how it's almost like a birth. You just have a one word and then it leads to a book, and there's so much happening in between. And you know, for those out there who are in the process of submission, I'll just kind of quickly go through the process of how it went with New West. There was the beginning stage of submitting to Matt, the first article, which was called The Ryukyuan, and then the correspondence with him, working with Claire Kelly on all the pre-production and also the polishing that kind of overlapped the work with my wonderful editor, Leslie Vermeer, and then working with Natalie Olson on the cover design and also the layout, because it's not just the cover design. And I noticed that with both CJ's and Randy's too, the layout and the typography inside is also quite beautiful, and it matches the cover too. Anyways, I also want to recognize that Carolina Ortiz is working very hard with Christine Kohler on all the things that are related to the post-production and these events. And it's truly amazing how New West balances that professionalism with the heart. And I really appreciated that within the last half year, the last 8 months. So I am so grateful that my book found a home with New West Press. And I also wanted to just quickly say thank you to family, friends, and colleagues who found the time in their lives tonight to attend. And I know some of you also went to the in-person event, so really thank you very much. I know that my cousin from Okinawa is up there too. I see her there, Rika, and my auntie from Calgary, and other family members from different parts of the world. I just want to thank also co-host Glass Bookshop Meka, and remind everyone to please support your local independent bookstores. I want to congratulate the New West press writers who have, and I hope will become friends in the future, CJ Lavigne and Randy Nikkel Schroeder, on the publication of their books in VERITAS and Arctic Smoke. And we've corresponded a bit, CJ, but this is the first time we've been in the same space with one another, and it's really nice to see you. I hope we do it again. And Randy and I have participated recently in the in-person book event here in Lethbridge at Analog Books, another independent bookstore. And Randy and I, it turns out we have an odd connection. So that's another weird thing too. But we were literally next door neighbors to one another in our teenage years. I'm looking right out at the window at his house when he was growing, the house he grew up in. And it's a coincidence that I've kind of yet to wrap my head around. So thank you everyone for making this happen. And I'll be reading from the story Redux in the EZRA'S Ghosts collection. And this reading is reflective of my exploration and also experimentation in intersecting the creative writing with academic theory, because I have been going to school for the last decade. And so when I write creative fiction, it naturally just either has a tension or they're supporting one another back and forth, like a pinball machine kind of. It just, to me, stretches the practice in different ways, and I don't mind experimenting at my age. I wrote this story while at the end of working on my master's thesis on the Okinawan Canadian diaspora with my supervisor, Gideon Fujiwara, I think, who's out in the audience, and now with my PhD supervisors, and I'm not sure if they're there, Carly Adams, Darren Aoki, Gideon again, Jason Larondo, and new to the supervisory committee is I'm excited about it, Gregory Smits from Penn State, who does focus on the Ryukyus, which is part of my book, my story in EZRA'S. Before my daughter left to attend school in Japan at the end of 2019, before any of us knew the word novel coronavirus, and before any of us knew that it was about to change our worlds, she left her cat with me, Mochi. And within this reading, there's a holographic cat that kind of weaves and she glitches throughout the story. She's not a replicant, Matt, but I think she's more like a hologram. So it takes place over 20 years after the beginning of the global COVID spread. And the timeline is August 2044. The characters from the first story from the thesis are also featured in this last story. Slow, so slow, she receded. At this point in life, uneventful was fine. Kate McNeil had even come to terms with agonizing over loss, grief, and solitude. In Paris, she could actually imagine the slow beauty in that kind of ideology. In fact, there were lycées that delivered such secondary curricula peripheral to their religious studies program. Quietude was an academic discipline. As part of the post-pandemic movement, many companies had diversified and dedicated themselves to the hidden existence culture, to serving the life of the mind. Along with her laptop and the old-fashioned books, as her son referred to them as, she brought several virtual and traditional streaming services such as Spotify playlists that included holographics and the aromatization of rain, ocean, and florals. Most importantly, she had brought Zen. Zen was Kate's cat. Since the beginnings of the global pandemic over 20 years ago, cats had become popular companions for the new breed of agoraphobic. At this time, more than any other in history, it was widely observed that having a cat as a companion contributed significantly to healing, wellness, and mental health. It was simple as that. The status of the cat and its ubiquitous acceptance rose in even boutique hotel establishments such as Laika, the place. She simply wanted to burrow in obscurity amid a curation of silences. Here at this place, in room 362, where she was convinced Nick's essence lingered, the virus. There were so many sudden deaths beginning in 2020. In some cases, and for whatever reason, the spirits seemed to stay. They stayed in places and spaces and landscapes, and they even stayed within the living. Not an assumption that she alone possessed. There had been thousands of documented sightings, miracles, and phenomena surrounding the people who had suddenly died. Though these ghosts were ephemeral, they were means to regenerate. There were two means to regenerate. How to restore a loved one in two ways. Number one, apology. Number two, self-manifestation. If the new technology was available in their locale, and if they could afford it, some had their loved ones reanimated through the hology procedure. The arrangement was as costly as a mortgage on a house. It was one of those big ticket items that couldn't possibly be considered if massive layoffs loomed or if work was precarious. One kept in mind, therefore, that for many, the decision was unfortunately fettered by employment instability and the generational post-pandemic fallout. But if one could and was tolerant of version glitches, hology was certainly a way to bring back a loved one. The downside was that the capacity to touch and hold was limited. And once you had arranged for the hology procedure, self-manifestation, the second means of bringing back a loved one, was impossible. Yet self-manifestation was the ideal method of revival. Though uncommon, despite the time commitment and the related risk of sinking into madness, it was more desirable than hology. For rather than mere facsimile, self-manifestation produced a full-fledged resurrection. Only about 100 cases of self-manifestation had been documented since 2020, but it was possible. The process began with finding the place. Laika was their place, an unplanned stopover in Paris between Cambridge and Ezra. They attended the International Summer Program at Cambridge in 2019. He was so bright that scholarships and study tours came easy, as did bursaries in those early years. Nick seemed to land everything he sought. In his heart, a seed small and powerful. He couldn't squander opportunity, for it was everything that his interned grandfather never had. Kate had a theory that Nick was the genius, and she, a mediocre student, simply rode on his study travel coattails. The truth was that they complemented and prodded each other. She saw pale things, how soft midday shadows fell and traveled over the walls and desks during Jacobson's Block D International Development Lectures, how classmate Zhao Li described with detailed brilliance the AI chess assignment he was doing back home in China, and then how timid in a lovely way he became when asked in Literature 3 class to deliver an oral analysis of Spenser's The Fairy Queen. And while earbudded, Kate recognized how the water fountain in the confines of the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies Library vestibule complemented the music of her Sowako playlist. That was the magic of the relationship. They saw the world differently in some ways, the same in others. While at Cambridge, Nick focused on Asian studies and took a series of workshops and seminars offered by Ryukyuan scholar Dr. Setsuko Oshiro. There was also research he wanted to conduct in the many libraries. Kate was more interdisciplinary and chose to take in the afternoon neuroscience, church art, architecture, photography, and artificial intelligence plenaries at Selwyn. She found that the discourse from English fluent learners from across the Asian continent took inclusive student engagement to a level she was not accustomed to. In this classroom, she thrived on the diverse dialectic rigor of forward-thinking global voices outside of the Western theoretical sphere. But it wasn't the study that Kate remembered most about the sleepless summer school stretch. It was the pre-class and late night excursions with Nick. She would ache through the lecture-filled days for those drips of passionate randomness in the romantic dawns and nightfalls of Cambridge Corners. Her most beloved memories were of those early mornings when the sun, despite following on the heels of retiring shadows that knew, failed to expose their alcove embraces, and in the evenings in dusky passageways so well hidden that even the ancient starry nights were oblivious. As planned, after the semester at Cambridge was complete, they took the train to Paris. But before heading to Roissy and taking the nonstop Air Canada Aero back to the prairies, they lingered for a few rainy days. On the first evening in Paris, they stumbled into a dark nook from which jutted a sullen wooden sign hanging on a wrought iron arm. Carved into the sign, Leica of the Obscure Ways, established 1821. Soaked, shivering, bedraggled, they huddled within beneath what could only be described as a broken-hearted portico. They knocked tentatively at the door, almost not wanting it to open, but it did open to sanctuary. Kate had always enjoyed hiding in things that possessed creation potential, a pencil that leaned towards B, a Greek tragedy, a blank piece of paper that didn't bleed, a scalable four-letter word in vector format, a prepped and loaded camera, Nick's shadow, instrumentals, the latter this morning in the form of Peter Bjornstad's weather-appropriate brooding compositions. Still, and yet, and here, and why. Kate embraced the simplicity and nothings of circular field recording meditations hidden in Paris days. Oh, sorry. She watched as Zen moved quietly, predatorily around the bottom of the shears as they wavered and bloomed in the breeze. After essing around the undulating white cloths, the creature leapt with a graceful arc onto the bedding. Old Noro priestess's kimono with its cotton layer soft and worn, waiting for the brew. Kate watched Zen curl, groom, close her sapphiric eyes, stretch long, and settle into Shavasana. That's it.
Great, thanks, Darcy. Let's just get the video back on to me. Yes, thank you. Some happy clapping. Can you make me the focal point again there, Carolina? I got Darcy, Randy, and CJ back, but I'm going to ask a few questions now, and if you yourself have questions, please put them in the chat and make sure you're talking to everyone rather than, just another person in the chat so we can all see, and then I can bring the question up with the authors. But it's just kind of a starter one. So your books, all three of them really, our dearly departed president, Douglas Barber, who's a big sci-fi fan, he really liked all three of your books a lot. And that was kind of his thing, was the intersection of literary work and Western Canadian authors, as well as sci-fi fantasy. Like, he really liked being able to mix the two. And I'm wondering, it seems like the literary world and the sci-fi fantasy world are just commingling even more than normal. There's your three books. There's Atwood's doing another Handmaid's Tale book. Marlon James is doing like his Black Lord of the Rings type thing with his trilogy. Gary Steingart or Jennifer Egan, her new book is set in the future. So what is it about this present moment that makes literary authors who would normally be writing about sad university professors or whatever, why are they writing about futuristic stuff, or why are they writing fantasy? Is it maybe that we're all kind of sick of right now and we want to think about something else? That's my guess, but Darcy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think what you just said, Matt, is a really good point, because I know that the last couple of years, the writing and the isolation shoveling snow in isolation in the middle of the morning, and then coming in to write, and then putting a candle on and be by myself in solitude. It was a way to escape like this pandemic. And about the sci-fi, maybe it has to do with what's happening in the world. And my interest in the sci-fi and the kind of ghostly horror and the magic realism genres, I kind of feel like they're merging even more and overlapping even more. I don't know if, Randy and CJ feel the same way. I still have my go-tos though that are pretty fundamental to me, like we talked about before, like film is a really big influence to my writing. And I know there's a lot of dystopian film out there too, and as well as combining it with, other genres. Maybe it's just I've always liked like Peter Jackson because I'm a visual person, the Lord of the Rings and King Kong, but I can see that being, dystopian and fantasy, and the same with, Akira Kurosawa's collection of vignettes, like we talked about before, Dreams. Those also talk about sci-fi, ghostly horror, magic realism. And, one of my favorites in the last decade is Denis Villeneuve's Arrival, which is based on a Ted Chiang short story. And I love Ted Chiang. So I'm not sure what Randy and CJ might think.
Yeah, Randy, are we currently living in sci-fi right now? We're dealing with a completely new virus that changed the entire world? Is that just the plot of a Star Trek episode? What happened to us?
Well, William Gibson said, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed, right? But actually, thinking about your question, I was reminded of a story that the World Fantasy Award-winning Texas writer Sean Stewart used to tell, because he did a Master of Fine Arts at the U of A with Rudy Weeb. And he says Rudy Weeb once told him, Sean, when are you going to give up this science fiction and this fantastical stuff and start writing serious fiction? And I think that anecdote, not mine obviously, but that anecdote really drives home, for me anyway, the point that I think non-fantastical or non-speculative literature is pretty much, in my opinion, a Canadian invention. So literary fiction, I think, is a middlebrow in Canada, is a middlebrow construction that gives a certain kind of books a place on a bookshelf. But if I think of world literature, I just don't see that it's ever been any different. I mean, if you think of names like Angela Carter or Borges or a guy named Shakespeare, I mean, all of them worked in fantastical traditions, horror traditions, etc. So I don't know if I see any shift, to be quite honest.
Interesting. I'm trying to look up the name, but I remember there was a book. It's a really, 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 really early sci-fi book, like H.G. Wells' time. And I believe it was by a Canadian author, and it's like Story Found in a Metal Tube. One of you academics who study it will probably find it quicker than I will. But Canada does seem like we are good at thinking up of fantastical stories, and sometimes they're even set in our nation's capital, like in VERITAS. What do you got, CJ?
Yeah, the genre versus literary divide. I mean, I don't describe myself as a literary author who has sci-fi elements in her work. I'm a sci-fi fantasy author who writes literary. And I think part of the reason that we're seeing more of that is because we're finally seeing some breakdown in what's traditionally been the genre fiction writers think the literary writers are snobs. The literary writers think that the genre fiction writers are talentless hacks. And we finally start to see that break down in the last 20 years or so. I think the history of that sort of literary divide versus genre divide is buried in classism, basically. It's the same high culture, low culture debates that we've been having for centuries. And it's just really nice to see it sort of break down to the point where everyone can play in all of the sandboxes without making weird distinctions about what qualifies as literary and what doesn't, and how we decide, because it's always been a really, really thin line.
Yeah, and every year seems to get more science fictional than the last. We just have, horrible new things happen to us, but we also have amazing new things happen to us. And
I just
maybe we need to rely on those stories to tell us how to live through it.
could I just mention something about something that maybe is not touched upon too much, and it's the culture. The culture, I'm always looking at the cultural aspect and finding that kind of sci-fi, fantasy, magical realism. And I've found that in cultures that are South American, Mexican, Okinawan, like the Mexican directors were doing it a long time ago, Guillermo del Toro and Pan's Labyrinth, one of my favorite visual movies, fantasy, sci-fi, magical realism blend. And I think that might have been 2 decades ago. I don't remember for sure. Alejandro, Iñárritu, another Mexican director, in Birdman, that has a kind of a similar fantastical feeling to me that Del Toro does. And also Quran, those 3, Children of Men, one of my most favorite movies, dystopian, futuristic. Their deliveries to me, like growing up in an Okinawan Canadian family with a mom who always told stories and loved ghost stories, sound very familiar, and they're ancient and they're old cultures. And a few years ago, my daughter introduced me to this unusual series. It was called What We Do in the Shadows, in the Shadows. And recently a friend, Suzanne Atchison from work, she's a film buff too, and she introduced me to her favorite movie, which was Jojo Rabbit. So I've been a bit obsessed with Taika Waititi from New Zealand, and how he merges like the horror with the sci-fi and this futuristic in a very humorous visual way. And for me, like, the visual is, the palettes are really, they impact me a lot. So I see a lot of cultural intersections too with the Canadian that we're talking about. So
Waititi is really interesting too as an Indigenous filmmaker, because he can work some of those themes into things that wouldn't really make any sense otherwise. It's like the 3rd Thor movie, which he directed. It kind of it notes at a certain point that the people of Asgard are like, they are the place of Asgard. Like, Asgard could be destroyed, but the people still exist. So he's a very interesting filmmaker. I have a question from the audience here. And it's kind of funny. Is it a coincidence that all 3 of you weird authors are all academics? I actually don't think that's a coincidence at all. That totally makes sense to me. But CJ, what do you think?
Yeah, that's fair. I can't turn that off. So there's weird esoteric stuff that ends up filtering into everything I write. In VERITAS in particular, I'm a communications scholar, and in VERITAS is really inflected by my thoughts on the limitations of language and how all of our stories are always inevitably incomplete. And there's a bunch of, 101 level introduction to communications theory that's kind of layered throughout. And yeah, I mean, people thought I was weird before I went into academia, but it's also possible that I've found a home in academia because I'm a little bit eccentric. So I would grant that definitely shows up in my work.
What do you think, Randy? Do you have to be a weirdo to become an academic? Is that like part of the job description, or what?
No, the common caricatures of academics, I find are quite, I find them quite interesting, because most academics I know, probably including myself, are actually quite boring. And, the other 2 authors on this panel, notwithstanding, of course. And it seems to me that the people who drop out of academia are the seriously interesting people. They can't, they can't sort of muscle their way through, because they see to the heart of it. But, I'd like to come up with an interesting answer, but I do suspect it actually is a coincidence. One of the interesting things about the narrative structure versus mathematics or statistics that we know for a fact is that coincidences happen a lot more often than we think they do, right? They happen a lot more often and a lot more regularly in real life than you could ever get away with in a narrative structure. So that's my answer. It's probably dull, but I think it probably is a coincidence, and we probably shouldn't read anything into it. Though having said that, it's interesting to read something into it. So
What do you think, Darcy? Is there something to the life of the mind, if you wanted to talk about a Coen Brothers movie, Barton Fink? John Goodman says, I'll show you the life of the mind. And is there something to sitting around reading books and thinking hard that makes you weird, or do you have to be weird to consider that as a profession?
You know what, I was kind of weird from day one. And I come from a family, we're very proud of being weird. I was a square peg from day one. I'm not sure, I think it is, we've got all of us have something weird in us. And I'm not sure if it's just because it's academia, because I'm also unusual in that I started my academics later. So I didn't start my academics till about 14 years ago. And I was a tradesperson from prior to that. So, and I was always the same kind of weirdness. So I don't know if the academia changed me to weirder. I just think, you know, we all have some sort of weirdness about us. And maybe because we're writers, it's more out there.
Well, I've got a question here from Megan, who asks, what was your favorite part of writing these stories? And let's go free for all. Who wants to go first? Unmute, go for it. CJ.
Definitely the moment when I finished it was my favorite part. But apart from the obvious joke, there are a couple of moments in the book where the protagonist, who is reading the manuscript as it's being written, breaks in and talks to the narrator. And I really had a lot of fun writing those parts. Like at the very end of the reading that I just gave, where Verity is stabbed and the angel touches her and she might die, cliffhanger, except the protagonist immediately breaks in to say, this is a ridiculous cliffhanger. We're in chapter 5. I clearly did not die. What are you doing? And the narrator's like, oh, fine, and continues. So it was those little interchanges and little interjections were probably my favorite bit writing the book.
Yeah, all three of your books really have a meta aspect to them too. So what do you say, Randy?
well, my favorite part is always putting the huge puzzle together before I write. I often say that the writing is finally just putting the paint on. But you know, this is how I write.
Oh wow.
That's my favorite part. It's it's very much a kind of puzzle making, causality connection making process that for me is very tactile and very analog. It involves cards and bulletin boards and that kind of thing, which I love.
So you're a plotter, not a pantser, as they say.
Well, I'm the worst of both worlds, but more of a plotter for sure.
Darcy, what was your favorite part of working on this book?
I think my favorite part is definitely the process. You know, I'm not that great at social, so this is not my favorite part, although I'm enjoying it. I love the company, but
You're doing a great job.
Yeah, okay. My favorite part is the process. I absolutely am a nerd with process. And right now, I don't feel right. I haven't written fiction for about 5 months. And, you know, I've been writing mostly academic essays and, you know, trying to meet the end of semester deadlines. And, you know, I think that when I'm not in the process, and it's a different process when you're writing academic papers as opposed to fiction writing. But when I'm not in the fiction writing process, and it's been this long, I kind of need to integrate it into my academics somehow, whether it be with graphic novelization or with the proems that I have integrated into my, my papers that my supervisors have been very patient with me, and I really appreciate that. But it's the process that I absolutely love, and the fine tuning and the polishing, anything that has to do with just, you know, scribbling down on paper.
Well, we got a question here from Elizabeth who asks, do your friends or family members ever wonder if one of your characters is based on them? And what do you say to them in that case? And I will also add, if it, like, is it a character who dies, for instance? Is it someone who has a nasty end? Because that could be quite the conversation. What do you think, Randy? Did it ever happen to you?
Yeah, I always find that a really interesting question, and the associated question of how much of the author, like how much of you is in there, right? You live this life, and so all of those kinds of questions where people seem to be really interested in where the fiction and the autobiography overlap. But in my experience, it's actually quite a bit duller than that. I know it's a good way to rouse interest in books, but I think most of us who write are, I think the common analogy would be we're magpies, right? We pick little traits up, character traits, ways of speaking here and there, and then we put them together in composites. So the fact of the matter is, I don't think any character is ever based on anyone, though they might have, many traits or tics or habits that are borrowed from all over the place.
Darcy, your book takes place in sort of an imagined version of Lethbridge, and there's numerous Japanese families in the story. So has there been any people thinking, hey, is that me?
Well, I try not to do that because I think there's so many other options. But, like Randy said, I think that, that was one of my characters for Randy and CJ, is that, how do you develop your characters? Well, it's like anything, you go by lived experience. Even with drawing, you go by lived experience. And there's bound to be some kind of commonality with humans and characters. We have common traits. And I would say that a lot of it for me is mostly probably drawn from myself and my perceptions and, how I see the world. But I don't necessarily, except for Odori, that was based upon my mother, right? And her experience in Battle of Okinawa, fictionalized. So that was closer. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it did. And CJ, there's a lot of bizarre people in your book, so I'd be very curious to know if any of them have relations to anyone you know, because just thinking back to all the sort of weird backstories and things, I would be very impressed if one of them was based on a real person.
Yeah, there are a couple of characters in the book who have names in common with my coworkers, and it was a complete coincidence. They're common names, and I had the book drafted before I knew people, and like it just, like one of them was Laura, and I'm sorry, Laura, I apologize, Laura, that I actually know. The Laura in the book is not you, but those were probably the only questions that I really fielded, because yeah, the characters are a little strange. Most of them are different aspects of me, to be honest. Like Verity is my inability to talk to other people. Probably the only exception is Colin, who is the angel and is way nicer than I am in any circumstance. But I will be honest, I've got a short story coming out later this year where one of the characters is absolutely and completely based on a guy who irritated me 25 years ago. And I will own up to that. But apart from that, really, if anyone asks you, deny everything.
The sweetest revenge. 25 years later, you can finally own some guy. We have a question here from Sho, who asks, Darcy, thank you so much for your reading. Ezra's Ghosts is a special work for me as a Ryukyuan author. Compared to your last work, Odori, it feels like the spirits of Okinawa have come to exist and perhaps make their homes in the prairies. I'm wondering how you made sense of bringing these histories to life when the Ryukyus are rather unknown to your average Canadian reader. Who is your audience? Do you see magical realism as a genre, simply another way of naming or representing our cosmologies? So it's a few questions there, but kind of how do you square the circle between the Ryukyu Islands and Lethbridge? Because they would appear not to have too much in common on the surface.
I think that is easy for me because, my family and I grew up Canadian, but we also grew up with the Okinawan culture very strongly embedded within our upbringing. So, for example, we had annual kerokais. And I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a celebration of the elderly. And we would spend months and months dancing, practicing odori. My mom would teach us all the different steps with fans and, you know, kimonos and, you know, all of the other tools that we had to use for each different dance. And so there was the sanshin, which I think you play. And that was really common because my grandpa Shima actually was an expert at playing the sanshin. My mom played the sanshin. There was a handful of people growing up that played the sanshin. We would go, you know, to my grandpa's place, and there would be a party there, and sanshin and singing and dancing would be part of it. And then, you know, I'd go to school, and it would be Canadian, or it would be a Saturday night, and we'd be watching Hockey Night in Canada with Dad, or we'd be watching the Grey Cups. So our lives actually did straddle two different worlds. So for me, it is prairie and ocean, and that's just a natural thing for me to see it that way.
Matt, can I
There
just
you
make
go,
one
Sho.
quick note?
Go for it, CJ.
Sorry, just because I noticed the question referred to magic realism as a genre. I think when we talk about magic realism, it's really important to acknowledge that that specific term is for writing that came out of oppression in Central and Latin America. So my work, for example, has cosmetic elements in common with magic realism, but I wouldn't describe it as magic realism. I tend to say literary urban fantasy or contemporary urban fantasy, something like that, if I'm talking about my work, which was written in Canada. That's it. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, it's kind of, I always think of that, what, Marquez and Borges and those sorts of guys. That's your classic magic realism. But do you have any more questions from the audience? Chat, write it down in the chat real fast in case you got one. Oh, there we go, Elizabeth. For everyone, has a character you're writing ever suddenly taken on a life of its own and tried to steer the story in a direction rather than the one you originally intended, and how do you handle that? So when your characters gain sentience, what do you do? CJ, that seems like something that might have happened to you.
It didn't have, in VERITAS was actually really strictly regimented. So I had that one plotted out. I wouldn't say it happened with that one because the characters wanted to go this way and I'd be like, no, back in your box. I did have it happen with a short story earlier this year. It suddenly turned queer. I didn't know it was going to when I started writing it. And then that's where it ended up. And you know what? Sometimes you just go with the flow.
Randy, any of your characters jump off the page and say, hey, I want better stuff to happen to me?
I wish I could say yes, but I can't, because I don't know, I'm the type of writer that I guess I'm a working writer rather than a literary writer, and I take very seriously the Hollywood cliche that characters are not people and dialogue is not conversation. So I puzzle out the characters in a very, I guess, seemingly mechanical way, and hopefully they don't seem that way on the page, but I can't say they ever take over. I wish they would possess me, but they don't.
It's off that's strange considering like the ending of your book. It kind of does feel like a character is sort of manifesting in a weird way, but you'll have to buy the book to find out if you haven't read it. And Darcy, has any of your characters ever talked to you?
I don't know. It's hard to talk about it when you're not in the middle of it, you know? It's just a different kind of a shift when we're doing this, as opposed when you're writing, you're in a totally different zone. They probably have. Sorry, I don't think I can answer that very well.
Well, they're not talking right now, I guess. So that's something. Any more questions from the audience, or perhaps we can move on to shutting the event down and talking to Magda again, and you all going to Glass Bookshop website and buying copies of these books, because I think they're pretty great. Any last call on questions? Nope, seems like everyone learned everything they wanted to know. So there we go. So I believe Magda wants to talk to us a little bit more about Glass Bookshop again and kind of wrap up the night, or was I incorrect on that one?
No, you got it. I mean, I don't really have
Perfect.
all that much to say, but I will kind of start to wrap things up here. Yeah, what a fantastic event. What a great series of readings and questions from everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to pop back in briefly to remind everyone that all 3 of the titles featured during tonight's launch, plus any other books your heart desires, truly, are available at Glass Bookshop. So either IRL or online at glassbookshop.com. On behalf of the entire Glass Bookshop team, I'd like to thank Matt and Carolina and everybody else at New West for having us. And I want to extend that same gratitude to Darcy and CJ and Randy. Again, thank you all for your extraordinary readings and also your generosity in terms of your responses to these questions. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in from their homes in various corners of the world for your time and attention this evening. I can hear the rain really starting to ramp up outside my window here in Edmonton. So we're closing out right at the perfect time. And yeah, for the last time, I'll pass things over to Matt just to send us off. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and thanks to Glass Bookshop for being a really great bookstore. We like you a lot. Randy, CJ, Darcy, you want to say bye to everyone? And yeah, any last words you want to impart?
Sorry, what was the question?
Any last words you want to impart? No?
Stay kind.
Yeah.
Everyone should pick up Darcy's book because it's really good.
Should buy all 3 of these books. They are great. But thanks to everyone for coming out to book launch. I know, we are all kind of not as into Zoom these days now that we can go out in person, a lot of us. And I just really appreciate you coming and supporting an independent Canadian press, because we need your help, really. It's word of mouth and stuff like that. That's what keeps us alive. So thank you for, listening to these authors and buying these books and telling your friends. That's step 1. If you like this book, tell a friend, and lend it to your grandma. Hopefully she likes it too. Okay, well, thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks for coming out, and thank you, Darcy, Randy, and CJ for your readings. And yeah, we'll catch you on the flip side.